In the Middle Ages, wars were not decided only on the battlefield. They were decided in whispers, in letters sealed with wax, in footsteps echoing through foreign streets at night. A single man carrying the wrong message could change the fate of an empire. And if he was caught, there would be no trial as we understand it today. No prison sentence measured in years. No mercy guaranteed by law. There would only be punishment, not simply to kill him, but to warn the living. In medieval empires, loyalty was sacred. It was sworn not to flags, but to kings, emperors, and gods. To betray that loyalty was not a crime, it was a disease. And diseases, they believed, had to be cut out, sometimes slowly, sometimes publicly, sometimes in ways designed to be remembered for generations. Imagine standing in a crowded square at dawn. The city is awake but silent. Merchants pause, soldiers watch, priests murmur prayers. At the center stands a man accused of seeing too much. Knowing too much, serving the wrong master. His punishment is not meant for him alone. It is meant for you. Across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and the great steppe empires, rulers understood something deeply. Fear travels faster than armies. A blinded traitor returning home was a walking message. A head displayed on a gate was diplomacy. A family erased from history was a warning written in blood. These empires did not share borders alone. They shared spies. Men sent across enemy lands to count soldiers, bribe officials, steal secrets, and sabotage trust. Some were professionals. Others were merchants, monks, translators, or diplomats who served two masters. And when the illusion failed, when a false identity cracked, when a coded message was discovered, the response was swift. Because to medieval rulers, a spy was worse than an enemy soldier. A soldier fought openly. A spy poisoned from within. There was no single punishment for espionage. Each empire answered betrayal in its own way, shaped by religion, culture, law, and fear. Some chose mutilation over death. Some chose spectacle over silence. Some believed execution was too kind. What united them all was certainty. Certainty that mercy invited weakness. Certainty that an example once made would echo far beyond the body it destroyed. Tonight, we are not here to glorify cruelty, nor to judge the past by modern laws. We are here to understand power. To understand how medieval empires defended themselves when walls were breached not by armies, but by secrets. In the shadows of castles, palaces, and tented capitals, spies were hunted. And when they were found, the punishment was never accidental. It was deliberate, symbolic, and unforgettable. This is the story of how medieval empires punished spies and traitors, and what those punishments reveal about the world they ruled. Before we speak of punishment, before we describe blades, chains, darkness, or death, we must first understand what the medieval world believed had been broken. Because in the Middle Ages, betrayal was not abstract. It was not a legal category defined by paperwork or precedent. It was intimate. It was personal. And above all, it was sacred. To betray an empire was not merely to disobey a law. It was to violate a bond believed to be ordained by forces far greater than man. Modern societies speak of citizenship. Medieval societies spoke of allegiance. Allegiance to a king whose bloodline was said to be chosen by God. Allegiance to an emperor believed to uphold cosmic order. Allegiance to a caliph ruling in accordance with divine law. Allegiance to a Khan whose authority came from destiny itself. These were not symbolic relationships. They were living contracts. When loyalty was sworn, it was often sworn publicly, on holy texts, before witnesses. Sometimes with oaths believed to bind the soul beyond death. To break such an oath was not only treason, it was perjury before heaven. This belief shaped everything that followed. There were no universal definitions of espionage, no standardized punishments, no agreed-upon rules of engagement. Instead, there was fear. Fear that secrets could undo walls, fear that a whisper could shatter armies, fear that a single man, unseen and unnoticed, could unravel years of conquest. In this world, spies did not always look like spies. They were merchants who traveled too often, monks who spoke too many languages, envoys who lingered too long, scholars who asked the wrong questions. Some were trained, others were coerced, many were desperate, and many never thought of themselves as traitors at all. A man might believe he was serving his faith rather than his ruler. Another might believe loyalty to his family outweighed loyalty to the crown. A third might believe survival itself justified betrayal. But medieval law did not concern itself with motivation, only with consequence. To be accused of espionage was to be placed outside the protection of ordinary justice. The rules that applied to thieves, murderers, and debtors no longer held. Spies were enemies who walked freely inside the walls, and enemies were not entitled to mercy. In many cases, there was no formal trial, no jury, no presumption of innocence. Interrogation replaced evidence. Confession replaced proof. And confession, whether true or not, was often inevitable. Torture was not considered a failure of justice. It was considered a tool of revelation. Pain, they believed, stripped away lies. Suffering, they believed, forced truth into the open. Once guilt was established or declared, the question was no longer whether punishment would occur. The question was how. Punishment in the medieval world served several purposes at once. It removed the threat. It satisfied divine justice. It reassured the ruler, and most importantly, it warned everyone else. This is why punishments were rarely private. Executions took place in city squares. Mutilations were performed before crowds. Bodies were displayed on gates, bridges, and roads. The punished individual ceased to matter. What mattered was the message. A punishment had to speak clearly. It had to tell soldiers what would happen if they deserted. It had to tell nobles what would happen if they conspired. It had to tell common people that power was watching and remembering. Different empires spoke different languages of punishment. Some spoke through death, others through survival. Some believed killing a traitor ended the threat. Others believed leaving him alive but broken was far more effective. A man without eyes could still be seen. A man without a tongue could still be pointed at. A man without hands could still beg. Living punishment traveled. It crossed borders. It entered homes. It told stories without words. Execution, by contrast, ended a story quickly. Yet even execution was rarely simple. Beheading, hanging, burning, crushing, each method carried symbolism. Each conveyed meaning about status, shame, and authority. A noble might be granted a clean death to preserve class order. A commoner might be denied it to reinforce hierarchy. A foreign spy might be executed differently than a domestic traitor. One had violated borders. The other had violated trust. And trust in the medieval mind was the greater crime. Some empires believed punishment should reflect the nature of the betrayal. A spy who used letters might lose his hands. A spy who spread lies might lose his tongue. A spy who observed too much might lose his sight. These were not arbitrary acts of cruelty. They were symbolic acts of control. They said, "You misused this part of your body. Now you no longer have it." Religion reinforced this logic. Sacred texts spoke of cutting away corruption, purifying the community, of sacrifice in the name of order. Rulers framed punishment as duty, not desire, as necessity, not vengeance. And the population raised within this worldview often accepted it. Fear was normalized. Violence was ritualized. Justice was visible. Yet even in this brutal system there were contradictions. Some spies were spared if their information was valuable. Some were turned into double agents. Some were imprisoned indefinitely, not dead but never free. Power was pragmatic. An empire might preach absolute loyalty, but it also understood the usefulness of betrayal when aimed outward. This hypocrisy did not weaken the system. It strengthened it, because it reminded everyone that loyalty flowed in one direction only, upward. By the late Middle Ages, every major empire had developed its own philosophy of punishment, not written in law codes alone, but embedded in culture. To understand these punishments is to understand how medieval rulers thought, what they feared, what they valued, what they believed power required. There was an empire that believed killing a traitor was too final, an empire that understood something many others did not. Death ends fear, but survival spreads it. This empire ruled not only through armies and walls, but through ceremony, symbolism, and calculated restraint. It called itself Rome, but history would remember it by another name. The Byzantine Empire. To its people, it was not merely a state. It was the continuation of divine order on earth, the last true Roman authority, the bridge between heaven and humanity. Its emperors did not rule by force alone. They ruled by legitimacy. And legitimacy, once broken, was far more dangerous than rebellion. In Byzantium, the greatest threat was not invasion. It was usurpation, plots within the palace, conspiracies among generals, foreign agents bribing officials. Letters passed in shadows, promising alliances, gold, or thrones. The Byzantines lived in a world where spies were everywhere because they believed power itself was fragile. So when a spy or traitor was discovered, the empire did something unusual. It often let him live, but it made sure he would never rule, never command, and never be forgotten. Blinding was the punishment Byzantium became infamous for. To modern eyes, it appears monstrously cruel. But to the medieval Byzantine mind, it was precise. An emperor was expected to be physically whole. Sight was essential, not just practically, but symbolically. A blind man could not lead armies. He could not read sacred texts. He could not preside over court ritual. Most importantly, a blind man could not be emperor. So when a rival claimant, a traitorous general, or a foreign collaborator was blinded, he was not merely punished. He was erased from the future. The act itself was ritualized. It was performed deliberately, sometimes publicly, sometimes within palace walls. Hot irons, knives, needles, methods varied. The result did not, darkness, but death was avoided because a dead man could become a martyr. A blind man became a warning. Imagine a former nobleman, once powerful, once feared, now led through the streets by a servant. People would whisper his name. Children would stare. Soldiers would remember. This was punishment that endured. And it was not limited to blinding. Byzantine justice favored mutilation over execution. Hands were removed to prevent writing or wielding weapons. Tongues were cut to silence persuasion and conspiracy. Noses were severed to mark shame permanently upon the face. Each injury carried meaning. Each injury told a story. A man without a nose was visibly dishonored. A man without hands was politically harmless. A man without a tongue could not inspire rebellion. These were not acts of rage. They were acts of governance. Byzantine law codes framed them as mercy. To spare a life, even a traitor's, was seen as Christian virtue. Execution was reserved for the most extreme cases, yet this mercy was calculated. Imprisonment also played a role. Dungeons beneath palaces, cells carved into stone, remote monasteries where prisoners were tonsured, stripped of identity and forgotten. For spies captured from foreign empires, the fate was similar. Some were executed quietly, especially if their information was dangerous. Others were imprisoned indefinitely. A few were turned. Byzantium excelled at counter-espionage. A captured spy was not always a liability. He could become a tool, threatened with mutilation, promised survival, forced to write false letters home. Betrayal was repurposed. This flexibility made Byzantium dangerous. It survived centuries longer than many of its enemies, not because it was stronger, but because it was subtler. Fear in Byzantium was not explosive. It was constant. Everyone knew what would happen if loyalty broke, not immediately, not necessarily violently, but inevitably. Foreign observers were both horrified and impressed. Western Europeans called Byzantine politics treacherous. Islamic chroniclers described it as cunning. Steppe empires respected its manipulation, yet all agreed on one thing. The punishment of traitors in Byzantium was unforgettable. A blinded man was not just an individual tragedy. He was a political statement. He said, "Power remains, rivals fall," And so for centuries Byzantium ruled an empire filled with spies by making examples that lived long enough to be remembered. But not all empires believed in restraint. Some believed fear must be immediate, visible, irreversible. In the lands to the west, punishment took a different form. There, justice was loud, final, and performed before crowds hungry for certainty. In medieval Western Europe, power did not hide its punishments. It displayed them. Where Byzantium preferred controlled injury and living warnings, the kingdoms and empires of the Latin West believed that justice had to be seen, heard, and remembered, not whispered about in palace corridors but shouted in marketplaces, nailed to gates, and burned into collective memory. Here, punishment was theater, and the audience was everyone. To understand how Western medieval empires punished spies and traitors, one must first understand how deeply social hierarchy shaped every aspect of life, including death. In this world, justice was never equal. A man's birth determined not only how he lived, but how he suffered and how he died. Loyalty was owed upward, always upward, from peasant to lord, from lord to king, from king to god. To betray that chain was to threaten the entire structure of society. And society responded with violence designed to restore order through fear. Spies in medieval Western Europe were rarely treated as a separate category. They were absorbed into the broader crime of treason, a word that carried immense weight and almost always meant only one thing: death. But not just death, a specific kind of death, one chosen carefully to communicate hierarchy, shame, and authority. For commoners accused of spying, foreign agents caught inside city walls, messengers intercepted with enemy letters, servants bribed to open gates, the punishment was usually swift and brutal: hanging. The gallows stood at the edge of towns or on nearby hills, visible from afar. Bodies were often left to rot as a warning. Hanging was not simply a method of execution. It was a statement. It said, "You were low and you died low." The rope denied dignity. It denied ceremony. It denied honor. For nobles, however, things were different. Even in betrayal, rank demanded recognition. A noble accused of treason or espionage, especially if tied to another kingdom, might be granted beheading instead. A sword, an axe, a single blow if the executioner was skilled. This was considered merciful, clean, appropriate for someone of status. The message was clear: you may have betrayed the crown, but your bloodline still mattered. Yet when betrayal was considered absolute, when a man was accused not only of spying, but of conspiring to destroy the realm itself, Western Europe reserved a punishment meant to eclipse all others: drawing and quartering. This punishment was not merely execution. It was disassembly. The condemned was dragged through the streets, tied to a hurdle or wooden frame so that the people could see his face, hear his cries, and understand exactly what betrayal earned. He was then hanged, but not until death. Still alive, he was cut down, his body was opened, his organs removed, his head severed, his remains divided. Each part had a destination: the head on a city gate, a limb on a bridge, another on a wall, another at a crossroads. The traitor became geography. Travelers learned loyalty by passing his remains. This punishment was rare but unforgettable. It was reserved for those whose betrayal was believed to endanger the very existence of the realm. Spies working for rival empires could fall into this category, especially during prolonged wars between Christian kingdoms or between Christian and Muslim powers during the Crusades. What mattered was not only what the spy had done, but what rulers believed his actions represented. Betrayal was contagious, and contagion, they believed, required extreme measures. Public executions were meticulously planned. Market days were chosen to ensure crowds. Church bells were rung. Clergy attended to frame the act as moral necessity. Prayers were spoken not for the condemned but for the stability of the realm. The condemned was sometimes allowed final words, sometimes denied them. Confessions, whether true or coerced, were often read aloud. The goal was clarity, no ambiguity, no sympathy, only certainty. The crowd was not passive. They shouted, they prayed, they jeered, they learned. Children were brought to watch, not despite the violence, but because of it. This was education. Western medieval justice believed fear was a public good. Yet even here, power was not absolute. Some spies were spared execution in exchange for information. Some were imprisoned indefinitely in towers or castles. Some were ransomed, traded, or quietly killed to avoid diplomatic fallout. But these were exceptions. The rule was spectacle, because Western rulers believed that authority weakened when it appeared merciful to traitors. A king who spared spies risked looking weak. A lord who hesitated risked rebellion, so they killed. And they made sure everyone knew why. But beyond the gallows and the scaffold, there was another punishment, one less visible but equally devastating: confiscation. A traitor's lands were seized, his titles revoked, his family disgraced. Sons were barred from inheritance, daughters from marriage. The punishment extended beyond the body and into generations. This was not accidental. Western medieval power believed betrayal should poison the future. In this way, a single act of espionage could erase an entire lineage. And still, spies continued to cross borders, because information was worth the risk, because empires needed eyes beyond their walls, because fear, no matter how carefully cultivated, was never absolute. To the east, Islamic empires developed a different logic of punishment, one shaped by religious law, imperial pragmatism, and the need to control vast, diverse populations. There, spies were not always displayed. Sometimes they were erased, sometimes they were used, and sometimes they were made examples in ways that echoed far beyond the execution ground. In the great Islamic empires of the medieval world, punishment did not begin with anger, nor even with fear alone, but with order. An order believed to be divinely revealed, legally structured, and entrusted to human rulers who were expected to preserve it not merely through power, but through responsibility. From Damascus to Baghdad, from Cairo to Cordoba, the caliphate was not only a political system, it was a moral architecture, one in which law, belief, governance, and security were woven together so tightly that betrayal could never be understood as a simple crime against the state, because the state itself was believed to be an extension of God's will on earth. In this worldview, espionage was not only dangerous, it was destabilizing at the deepest possible level. A spy was not simply someone who carried information to an enemy power. He was someone who threatened unity, who endangered the cohesion of the community, who risked unleashing chaos, fitna, the most feared condition in Islamic political thought, a state of disorder so destructive that it was believed to invite divine punishment upon society as a whole. Because of this, medieval Islamic rulers treated spies and traitors with a seriousness that went far beyond vengeance, framing punishment as necessity, restraint, and defense of the collective rather than personal retaliation. Islamic legal scholars classified espionage under several overlapping concepts, depending on context: as treason against the ruler, as collaboration with hostile forces, or as letter 1E25 IR a macron B a H, waging war against society itself. Each classification carried different implications, and this flexibility gave rulers immense discretion. A spy acting for a foreign empire during wartime might be executed immediately, often by beheading, a method considered swift, decisive, and legally clean, minimizing spectacle while asserting authority with clarity. But execution was not always the first choice. In many cases, particularly in the Abbasid period, rulers preferred containment over display, understanding that information was valuable and that a captured spy could be interrogated, pressured, or manipulated before being destroyed. Interrogation in the caliphates was systematic, often conducted by officials trained not only in coercion, but in psychological pressure, isolation, and prolonged uncertainty, where the threat of punishment was sometimes more effective than punishment itself. A spy might be imprisoned for months, even years, without formal sentencing, held in administrative detention while authorities extracted names, routes, contacts, and intentions, slowly dismantling entire networks rather than simply eliminating a single individual. This was justice as intelligence strategy. When punishment did occur, it was chosen carefully to match the perceived threat. Beheading was common, but it was not casual. It was usually carried out swiftly, often away from crowds, particularly when the condemned was foreign, because the caliphate understood that excessive spectacle could provoke retaliation, martyrdom narratives, or diplomatic consequences. Yet when rulers wanted a message to spread, they were capable of public punishment. In extreme cases, especially when betrayal was framed as open rebellion or mass subversion, the body of the executed spy might be displayed, sometimes cruciform, not as an act of religious symbolism in the Christian sense, but as a legal signal drawn directly from Quranic prescriptions regarding those who sow corruption in the land. These displays were rare, deliberate, and terrifying precisely because they were not routine. The population understood that such punishments marked a line that had been crossed, a betrayal so severe that restraint itself had been suspended. But perhaps the most distinctive feature of punishment in the Islamic empires was pragmatism. A spy who converted sincerely or convincingly might be spared. A spy whose information exposed a greater threat might be rewarded temporarily. A spy whose death would destabilize a region might be exiled instead. The goal was not moral purity. The goal was stability. And stability in an empire that stretched across languages, cultures, and religions required adaptability. Unlike Western Europe, where punishment emphasized class hierarchy, or Byzantium, where punishment emphasized physical disqualification, Islamic imperial justice emphasized containment of chaos, believing that disorder, once unleashed, could not easily be controlled. Families of traitors were not always punished collectively, as they were in China or sometimes in Europe, because Islamic legal tradition emphasized individual accountability, yet surveillance of relatives was common, and suspicion lingered long after punishment had been carried out. A man executed as a spy might be forgotten quickly. A man imprisoned indefinitely might vanish entirely, and vanishing in many ways was the ultimate punishment. No martyrdom, no public memory. No story to inspire imitation, just absence. But beyond the great cities, beyond the courts and scholars, another empire was rising, one that rejected restraint entirely, one that believed fear must be immediate, absolute, and overwhelming, one that treated espionage not as a crime to be judged, but as a threat to be annihilated without hesitation. On the open steppe, under a law that tolerated no ambiguity, spies were not corrected, converted, or contained. They were erased. On the vast open plains of Central Asia, where there were no permanent walls, no fortified cities to hide behind, and no borders that could be defended with stone alone, the Mongol Empire developed a view of loyalty so absolute, and a response to betrayal so uncompromising, that espionage was not treated as a crime to be analyzed, debated, or judged, but as a fatal condition that had to be eliminated immediately before it could spread. For the Mongols, power depended on speed, cohesion, and obedience, and anything that threatened these qualities, especially secrecy in the service of an enemy, was seen as an existential danger to the entire system of conquest. The Mongol world was built on trust enforced by terror. Orders had to be obeyed instantly across enormous distances. Armies had to move as one body. Information had to be controlled absolutely. A spy, therefore, was not merely an outsider. He was a fracture in the structure of conquest itself. This is why, under Mongol law, the yasa attributed to Genghis Khan, espionage and treason were punishable by death without exception, mitigation, or appeal, regardless of the spy's rank, origin, or usefulness. There were no noble privileges, no religious exemptions, no negotiated mercy. A spy was discovered, and then he was destroyed, often immediately. Unlike the empires we have already seen, the Mongols rarely staged elaborate public punishments, not because they were less brutal, but because their reputation for brutality made repetition unnecessary. Fear preceded them so thoroughly that the execution of a single spy, carried out decisively and without hesitation, could deter betrayal across entire regions. Execution methods varied, but symbolism mattered. Blood was often avoided when dealing with high-status prisoners or foreign envoys accused of espionage, because Mongol belief held that spilling noble blood could anger the spirits or bring misfortune. So instead, methods such as breaking the spine, crushing the body, or suffocating the condemned were used, ways to end life without visible bloodshed, while still ensuring absolute finality. For lower-status spies, execution could be swift and violent, carried out in front of soldiers rather than civilians, reinforcing discipline within the army rather than educating the population. There was no need for spectacle. The Mongol Empire ruled through reputation. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Cities that cooperated were spared. Spies who were caught were not warnings. They were confirmations of what everyone already believed. And yet Mongol punishment for espionage went beyond the individual. Collective responsibility was central to steppe law. If a spy was sheltered, aided, or concealed by a household, a village, or a military unit, punishment could extend outward, not symbolically but physically, resulting in mass executions or the destruction of entire communities. This was not considered cruelty. It was considered prevention. By making betrayal catastrophically expensive, the Mongols reduced the likelihood of betrayal occurring at all. Ironically, this extreme intolerance for espionage coexisted with a sophisticated intelligence system of their own. The Mongols relied heavily on scouts, informants, translators, defectors, and merchants who reported back on terrain, defenses, politics, and internal divisions long before armies arrived. Espionage was acceptable, but only when it served the Mongols. A Mongol spy caught by an enemy empire might be tortured or executed. A foreign spy caught by the Mongols would not survive long enough to be interrogated extensively. Information could be gathered elsewhere. Fear could not. This philosophy shaped Mongol expansion. When cities learned that spies were executed instantly, they became afraid to host them. When rulers learned that betrayal meant extinction, they hesitated to conspire. The Mongols did not need elaborate prisons. They did not need public trials. Their justice was fast, mobile, and irreversible, designed for an empire that moved constantly and tolerated no weakness. And yet, even the Mongols understood that absolute terror had limits. As their empire settled and fragmented into successor states, punishment practices began to change, absorbing local customs, religions, and administrative systems. In China, Mongol rulers adopted Chinese legal traditions. In Persia, they incorporated Islamic law. In Russia, they adapted to Slavic governance. Fear remained, but it was no longer the only tool, which brings us to one of the most complex systems of punishment ever devised for traitors and spies. Imperial China, where loyalty was cosmic, betrayal was hereditary, and punishment could extend far beyond the body, into family, memory, and history itself. In Imperial China, perhaps more than in any other medieval civilization, betrayal was not understood merely as a political act, nor even as a moral failure, but as a cosmic violation, an offense so profound that it was believed to disturb the balance between heaven, earth, and human society, threatening not only the stability of the state, but the harmony of the universe itself. The emperor did not rule by conquest alone. He ruled by the mandate of heaven, a sacred, conditional authority that depended on virtue, order, and balance. And because of this belief, treason and espionage were interpreted not simply as attacks on the ruler, but as direct challenges to heaven's will. To betray the emperor was to defy the cosmos, and crimes of that magnitude demanded punishments that reached far beyond the individual body. Chinese legal philosophy during the medieval period, particularly under the Tang, Song, and later Yuan dynasties, treated loyalty as an absolute moral obligation, embedded in family structure, social hierarchy, and ritual obedience, meaning that a spy was not merely a lone criminal, but the visible symptom of a deeper corruption that had to be removed completely, root and branch. This is why Chinese punishments for treason and espionage were among the most comprehensive, systematic, and psychologically devastating in the medieval world. Execution was common. Beheading was widely used, efficient, final, and symbolically clear, separating the head, the seat of identity and loyalty, from the body that had served the wrong master. But in cases of extreme betrayal, particularly when espionage was believed to have endangered the dynasty itself, execution alone was considered insufficient. Death ended suffering too quickly. It ended responsibility, and it allowed memory to linger. Instead, the state sought erasure. The most infamous punishment reserved for the highest crimes was lingcha, often translated as death by slow slicing, a sentence designed not primarily to cause pain, but to demonstrate that the traitor's body, like his loyalty, had been divided, corrupted, and rendered unworthy of wholeness. This punishment was rare, regulated, and symbolic, carried out under strict legal conditions, because its purpose was not cruelty, but demonstration, a visible statement that betrayal fractured the natural order itself. Yet even lingchai was only the beginning. What truly distinguished imperial Chinese punishment was the principle of collective responsibility. A spy did not suffer alone. Families were implicated. Parents, children, siblings, cousins, sometimes entire households, could be executed, enslaved, or exiled, not because they had acted, but because they had failed to prevent betrayal within their lineage. This concept, known as extermination of the clan, was intended to ensure that loyalty was enforced not only by fear of death, but by fear of destroying one's entire family line. In a society where ancestor worship and lineage continuity were central to identity, this was a fate worse than execution. Names were removed from genealogical records, property was confiscated, graves were desecrated, ancestral rites were forbidden. The traitor was denied the afterlife. His descendants were denied the past. Even those spared death were marked permanently. Some were sent to frontier regions as forced labor, building walls, canals, and fortifications under conditions designed to exhaust body and spirit alike. Others were enslaved by the state, absorbed into a system where survival itself became a form of punishment. The logic was absolute. If betrayal arose from a household, the household must disappear. If loyalty failed in one generation, future generations could not be trusted. This was not madness. It was deterrence refined to its most extreme form, and it worked. Espionage in imperial China did not vanish, but it became extraordinarily risky because anyone considering betrayal knew that the consequences would not end with their own death. Foreign spies were treated with particular severity. A captured agent from a rival dynasty or nomadic empire was proof that heaven itself was under threat. Such spies were interrogated relentlessly, their networks dismantled piece by piece, their existence erased so thoroughly that even their names might be lost to history. Silence was preferred to spectacle. Memory was the enemy. And yet, Despite this system of overwhelming punishment, Chinese emperors were not blind to pragmatism. Some spies were turned. Some were bribed. Some were absorbed into intelligence networks designed to protect the dynasty rather than destroy it. Because even in a system that believed in cosmic order, rulers understood something deeply human. Fear alone could not govern forever, but fear could shape generations. And that was enough. As the medieval world moved toward its later centuries, empires grew larger, borders more porous, and information more valuable than ever before. Punishments evolved. Some became more restrained, others more calculated, others more institutional. But the lesson remained constant across cultures and centuries. A spy was never just a man with secrets. He was a test of authority, a test of belief, a test of how far power was willing to go to preserve itself. In the final part of our journey, we will step back from individual empires and ask a larger question, one that connects the medieval world to our own. What do these punishments reveal about power itself? And how much of this logic still survives today? When we step back from the execution grounds, the dungeons, the palace corridors, and the silent roads where bodies once warned the living, what emerges is not simply a catalog of punishments, but a pattern, a shared logic that connects empires separated by geography, language, religion, and culture, yet united by a single, enduring fear: the fear of betrayal from within. Medieval rulers did not fear spies because they gathered information alone. They feared spies because they exposed a truth every empire struggled to deny. That power, no matter how absolute it appeared, was fragile, dependent on trust, perception, and obedience, and vulnerable to collapse not only from invading armies but from whispered secrets, forged letters, and unseen alliances. This is why punishments for espionage were never merely reactive. They were proactive instruments of governance. Across Byzantium, Western Europe, the Islamic caliphates, the Mongol Empire, and Imperial China, rulers understood that the way they punished spies would shape how loyalty itself was understood, internalized, and enforced. Some empires chose visibility. They made punishment loud, theatrical, and unforgettable, turning execution into spectacle so that fear would spread outward through crowds, families, and generations, embedding obedience into public memory. Others chose silence. They erased spies quietly, imprisoned them indefinitely, or transformed them into tools, believing that absence, uncertainty, and invisibility could deter betrayal just as effectively as public terror. Some punished the body, others punished the future. Some punished the individual, others punished entire bloodlines. But all shared one belief: that mercy toward spies was indistinguishable from weakness. Yet the medieval world did not invent this logic. It refined it. And in doing so, it passed it forward. As empires modernized, as law codes became more formal, as prisons replaced scaffolds and intelligence agencies replaced lone informants, the core assumption remained unchanged: that espionage was not simply a crime but a unique threat, one that justified exceptional measures. The language changed. The methods changed. The justifications changed, but the fear did not. Even today, states distinguish spies from ordinary criminals. They try them in secret courts. They classify evidence. They impose sentences that extend beyond imprisonment, stripping citizenship, erasing identities, silencing names. Public executions have vanished in most places, but public warnings remain. They appear in press conferences, in leaked photographs, in carefully worded statements meant to be read between the lines. The medieval scaffold has been replaced by the modern headline, and yet the emotional logic is the same. Betrayal must be seen to be punished. Fear must be managed. Loyalty must be enforced. What medieval empires understood, often intuitively, sometimes brutally, was that punishment is never only about the guilty. It is about the audience. The blinded Byzantine noble, the quartered European traitor, the vanished Abbasid spy, the crushed Mongol informant, the erased Chinese lineage. None of these punishments were designed primarily for the individuals who suffered them. They were messages. Messages written in flesh, memory, and silence. Messages that said, power is watching, power remembers, power responds. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all is not how different the medieval world was from our own, but how familiar its logic remains. Empires change names, borders shift, laws evolve, but fear of betrayal endures, because wherever power exists, someone will seek to undermine it. And wherever secrets matter, someone will risk everything to carry them. In the Middle Ages, that risk was paid in blood, darkness, exile, and erasure. Today, it is paid differently. But the question remains the same. How far will power go to protect itself from those who serve another master? That question has no medieval answer. Long after the gallows were dismantled, long after the palace dungeons collapsed into dust, long after the names of emperors, caliphs, khans, and kings faded from common memory, the shadow cast by medieval espionage and its punishments did not disappear, because it was never confined to a single place, a single century, or a single form of rule, but embedded itself into the very idea of how power understands vulnerability. The medieval world believed that order was fragile, that society existed in a constant state of tension between stability and collapse, and that betrayal, especially secret betrayal, was the force most capable of pushing that balance into chaos, because it did not announce itself with banners or armies but arrived quietly, disguised as loyalty, familiarity, and trust. This belief shaped everything. It shaped the laws that were written. It shaped the punishments that were chosen. And it shaped the moral language rulers used to justify acts that, even in their own time, were understood as extreme. What we see, when we trace these punishments across cultures and continents, is not randomness, nor cruelty for its own sake, but a grim consistency. The conviction that secrecy was more dangerous than open violence, and that a hidden enemy was more terrifying than an approaching one. Medieval empires did not fear spies because spies were rare. They feared spies because spies were inevitable. Borders could be crossed. Languages could be learned. Gold could buy silence. Faith could be exploited. Identity could be worn like a mask. And once rulers accepted this reality, punishment became the only language they believed could speak loudly enough to drown out temptation. Punishment was not merely corrective, it was preventative. It was designed to occupy the imagination, to linger in the mind long after the body had been destroyed or altered, to make potential traitors rehearse consequences before they ever considered action, and to ensure that fear became a constant companion to ambition. This is why medieval punishments often appear excessive to modern audiences. They were meant to be excessive. Measured responses were for ordinary crimes. Espionage was extraordinary. And extraordinary threats, medieval rulers believed, required extraordinary responses. Yet there is another truth, quieter and more uncomfortable, hidden beneath the spectacle and severity. For all their violence, medieval punishments did not eliminate espionage. Spies continued to exist. Secrets continued to travel. Empires continued to fall, not only because of enemies outside their walls, but because of fractures within. Fear restrained betrayal, but it never destroyed it. And this reveals the central paradox of power. The more absolute authority becomes, the more it fears what it cannot see. The harsher the punishment, the more valuable the secret appears. The more violently loyalty is enforced, the more tempting betrayal can become to those who feel excluded, marginalized, or desperate. Medieval rulers sensed this paradox, even if they could not fully articulate it. This is why they experimented, why some blinded instead of killed, why some erased families instead of bodies, why some imprisoned instead of executed, why some spies were turned rather than destroyed. Punishment was not static. It evolved, adapted, and responded to failure. And through that evolution, the medieval world left behind a legacy that extends far beyond its own centuries. It left behind the idea that espionage exists outside normal morality, that it occupies a gray zone where law bends, rights dissolve, and secrecy justifies excess. That those who cross this line are no longer ordinary people, but symbols, containers for fear, warning, and example. This legacy did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It was inherited. It passed into early modern states, into absolutist monarchies, into colonial empires, into revolutionary governments, and eventually into the modern nation-state, where it persists beneath new language, new institutions, and new technologies. The scaffold became the courtroom. The dungeon became the black site. The public square became the media cycle, but the logic endured. And so, when we look back at medieval punishments for spies and traitors, we are not merely examining cruelty from a distant past. We are studying a mirror, a reflection of how power reacts when it feels exposed, a reflection of how societies justify extreme measures in the name of survival, a reflection of a question that has never stopped being asked, even if it is rarely spoken aloud. How much violence is acceptable to protect order? How much fear is necessary to preserve loyalty? And at what point does the punishment meant to defend a society begin to reveal its deepest insecurities instead? The medieval world answered these questions with iron, blood, darkness, and silence. We answer them differently, but we are still answering them. And as long as secrets exist, as long as power fears the unseen, and as long as loyalty can be broken, the shadow of medieval espionage and the punishments that defined it will never fully disappear. Behind every punishment, behind every law, behind every carefully staged execution or quiet disappearance, there existed a figure the medieval world both relied upon and despised. The man who crossed the line between worlds, who spoke in borrowed accents, who learned to live with divided loyalties, and who understood, often better than the rulers themselves, just how thin the border between power and ruin truly was. The medieval spy was rarely a professional in the modern sense. He did not belong to an institution with training manuals or guaranteed protection. More often, he was a merchant who traveled too frequently between rival cities, a pilgrim who lingered suspiciously at fortresses, a translator whose knowledge of languages made him indispensable and dangerous at the same time, or a court official who had learned that secrets were more valuable than gold, but far more expensive to carry. Many spies did not begin as spies at all. They were recruited slowly, subtly, through obligation, desperation, or opportunity. A debt forgiven, a family member threatened, a promise of advancement, a grievance nurtured quietly over years. In this way, espionage was not an isolated profession. It was woven into the social fabric of medieval life, inseparable from trade, diplomacy, religion, and war. And because spies often came from within, punishment had to do more than destroy an enemy. It had to sever trust. This is why medieval rulers were obsessed not only with identifying spies, but with exposing them. Exposure was a form of purification. To reveal a spy was to reassure the population that betrayal could be detected, that secrecy was not invincible, and that power was not blind. This obsession with exposure explains why confessions mattered so deeply. A confession was not just proof of guilt. It was narrative control. By forcing a spy to confess, publicly or privately, rulers shaped the story of betrayal, determining who was blamed, what motives were assigned, and which fears were amplified. Confessions named accomplices. They explained methods. They transformed hidden networks into visible threats that could be hunted down and destroyed. Truth mattered less than usefulness. A confession that fit the ruler's needs was accepted. One that complicated the story was ignored. And once the story was written, punishment followed. But punishment did not always arrive immediately. In many cases, spies lived for weeks, months, even years under the knowledge that their fate was sealed, held in a state of suspended existence where every day could be the last, and every silence might conceal a decision already made. This liminal state was itself a punishment. It broke resistance. It encouraged cooperation. It extracted information long after hope had faded. Medieval prisons were not designed for reform. They were designed for waiting, waiting for execution, waiting for exile, waiting for mutilation, waiting to be forgotten. And yet not all spies were punished equally. Rank mattered, value mattered, timing mattered. A spy caught during peace might be treated differently than one caught during war. A spy whose information had already been used might be considered more dangerous than one intercepted early. A spy whose execution could provoke retaliation might be silenced quietly rather than displayed. Punishment was never purely legal. It was strategic. This is why some spies survived. They were traded in prisoner exchanges. They were sent back with false information. They were forced to write letters under supervision. They were turned into weapons against their former masters. Survival, however, did not mean freedom. A spared spy lived under constant surveillance, marked forever by suspicion, never fully trusted by either side, existing in a space where loyalty had already failed once and could never be fully restored. In this sense, punishment extended beyond the scaffold. It extended into identity itself. Once a man had crossed the line into espionage, once his loyalty had been questioned, he could never fully return to ordinary life. He became a creature of the margins, feared, watched, used. This reality shaped how medieval people understood loyalty. Loyalty was not assumed. It was enforced. It was monitored. It was proven repeatedly through ritual, obedience, and visible conformity. And punishment was the ultimate proof that enforcement worked. But as empires expanded and borders became more complex, a new problem emerged, one that medieval rulers struggled to solve. What happens when spies are no longer outsiders? What happens when betrayal does not come from a foreign agent but from within the ruling elite itself? From generals, from governors, from relatives, from heirs. The most dangerous spy in the medieval world was not the foreigner who crossed a border under cover of night, nor the merchant who carried coded letters sewn into his clothing, but the man who never had to cross a border at all, the man who already stood inside the palace, who spoke the language of power fluently, who understood court ritual, and who moved through halls of authority without ever drawing suspicion. This was the traitor from within, the courtier, the general, the governor, the advisor, the relative. These men did not need disguises because they already belonged. They did not need forged documents because their names were already written into the machinery of the state. They did not need to spy in secret because access itself gave them knowledge. And because of this, their betrayal was considered infinitely more dangerous than that of any foreign agent. In medieval political thought, the palace was not merely a residence. It was the symbolic heart of the empire, the place where authority flowed outward, where legitimacy was performed daily through ritual, ceremony, and proximity to the ruler's body. To betray the ruler from within that space was not just espionage. It was contamination. It suggested that power itself could not protect itself. This is why punishments for internal traitors were often harsher, more theatrical, and more emotionally charged than those imposed on captured foreign spies. A foreign spy could be dismissed as an outsider. An internal traitor exposed vulnerability. He raised uncomfortable questions. Who else knew? Who else was involved? How long had this been happening? And who, even now, could not be trusted? Medieval rulers were acutely aware that conspiracies rarely involved one person alone. They spread through networks of loyalty, obligation, and shared interest. A court official who passed information to a rival empire might be connected by marriage, patronage, or debt to others who remained silent, hidden and intact. Punishment, therefore, had to do more than eliminate the guilty individual. It had to break the network. This is why interrogations of internal traitors were often prolonged and relentless, not because rulers sought truth in an abstract sense, but because they sought names, connections, and vulnerabilities, mapping the invisible architecture of disloyalty that threatened to undermine their rule. A single confession could reshape an entire court. Positions were reshuffled. Officials were dismissed. Families were disgraced. Alliances were reconsidered. The execution or mutilation of a high-ranking traitor was rarely the end of the story. It was the beginning of a purge. Punishment in these cases became political surgery. The state cut deeply, sometimes too deeply, in an effort to excise a perceived infection, often destabilizing itself in the process. This was the risk medieval rulers accepted, because the alternative, appearing hesitant, uncertain, or forgiving toward internal betrayal, was far more dangerous. To forgive a traitor inside the palace was to invite imitation. It suggested that loyalty was negotiable, and in a system built on personal allegiance, negotiation was fatal. This is why executions of nobles, generals, and royal relatives were often surrounded by ritualized humiliation, stripping away titles, clothing, and symbols of rank before death, publicly transforming a figure of authority into a figure of disgrace. Crowds were invited not only to witness punishment but to watch power be reversed. A man who once gave orders now begged. A man who once commanded armies now knelt. A man who once whispered into the ruler's ear now spoke only to the executioner. The message was unmistakable. Proximity to power did not protect you. It condemned you. Yet there was another layer to this fear, one rarely spoken but deeply felt. If a trusted advisor could become a spy, then loyalty itself was unstable. It could not be guaranteed by oath, ritual, or reward alone. It had to be enforced constantly, and enforcement bred paranoia. Medieval courts were environments of intense surveillance. Servants listened. Guards observed. Messengers were intercepted. Letters were opened. Silence itself became suspicious. In such an atmosphere, punishment served not only as response but as reassurance. Each execution, each blinding, each exile allowed rulers to convince themselves and their subjects that betrayal had limits, that it could be detected, named, and destroyed. But history tells us something else. The more intensely courts punished internal betrayal, the more fragile trust became. Fear produced obedience, but it also produced secrecy. Loyalty became performance rather than conviction. And in performance, sincerity is difficult to measure. This tension shaped the final centuries of many medieval empires. Rulers became increasingly isolated. Courts became increasingly ritualized. Punishments became increasingly symbolic. Power retreated behind layers of ceremony, while espionage adapted, becoming more subtle, more cautious, and more deeply embedded in everyday administrative life. Which raises another question, one that medieval rulers rarely confronted directly. What happens when punishment itself begins to lose its power? When executions no longer shock? When mutilation becomes expected? When fear becomes routine? For centuries, medieval empires relied on punishment as their most reliable instrument of control, convinced that if the consequences of betrayal were sufficiently severe, sufficiently visible, and sufficiently unforgettable, loyalty would follow naturally, obedience would become instinctive, and the threat of espionage would be contained within manageable limits. But fear, like any tool used too often, began to lose its edge. As generations passed, punishments that once shocked became familiar, even expected, and the extraordinary slowly transformed into the ordinary, forcing rulers to confront an uncomfortable reality. Terror alone could not indefinitely sustain authority, and excessive punishment could, under certain conditions, weaken the very power it was meant to protect. In cities where executions were frequent, Crowds no longer gathered in reverent silence. They whispered, mocked, or looked away. In courts where purges were common, loyalty became cautious rather than sincere, calculated rather than heartfelt, with officials learning not how to serve faithfully, but how to survive quietly. Fear produced obedience, but it also produced distance. People complied outwardly while withdrawing inwardly, concealing thoughts, intentions, and alliances beneath layers of silence. For spies, this environment was paradoxical. On one hand, the risks were immense. On the other, secrecy became easier because suspicion was everywhere and nowhere at once. When everyone was afraid, no one stood out. Medieval rulers began to sense this shift. Chronicles speak of emperors, kings, and caliphs who increased punishments only to find conspiracies multiplying rather than disappearing. As violence alienated elites, destabilized alliances, and created pools of resentment that foreign powers could exploit. The logic of fear had limits, and when those limits were reached, empires adapted. Some attempted reform. They codified laws, formalized trials, and placed boundaries, however fragile, on punishment not out of compassion but out of calculation, believing that predictability might restore loyalty where terror had failed. Others shifted emphasis from punishment to prevention. They expanded surveillance networks. They rewarded informants. They institutionalized intelligence gathering. Spies were no longer hunted only after betrayal occurred. They were anticipated. This marked a subtle but profound transformation. Punishment became only one part of a larger system of control. Fear remained, but it was supplemented by incentives, rewards, and manipulation. A man might still be executed for spying, but another might be paid, another promoted, another forgiven. Power became more complex, and complexity, paradoxically, made espionage both more dangerous and more necessary. As empires stabilized internally, their competition intensified externally. Diplomacy grew more elaborate, trade expanded, borders became porous, information moved faster than armies, and with this acceleration, punishment had to keep pace. Some rulers turned toward symbolic punishment, focusing less on bodily harm and more on status destruction, exile, disgrace, confiscation, methods that removed threats without creating martyrs or public backlash. Others doubled down, escalating cruelty in a desperate attempt to reclaim fear's authority. Both strategies appeared across the medieval world, sometimes within the same empire, sometimes within the same reign. What united them was uncertainty. Rulers were no longer sure that punishment worked the way it once had, and this uncertainty produced one of the most important developments in the history of espionage: the recognition that loyalty could not be enforced by violence alone. Trust, paradoxically, became a strategic resource. Some medieval rulers began cultivating loyal elites through shared interest rather than shared fear, binding officials through privilege, wealth, and mutual dependency, creating systems where betrayal would cost not only life, but lifestyle, identity, and belonging. In these systems, punishment did not disappear. It changed function. It became targeted rather than universal, selective rather than spectacular, and spies adapted accordingly. They learned to blend in. They learned patience. They learned restraint. The age of impulsive betrayal gave way to an age of calculated secrecy, and with calculation came something new, something dangerous: professionalism. As medieval empires grew older, larger, and more interconnected, espionage slowly ceased to be an improvisation born of desperation or individual ambition, and began to transform into something far more enduring, far more disciplined, and far more threatening to traditional forms of authority. A practice that, while never openly acknowledged, increasingly resembled a profession, complete with methods, expectations, reputations, and consequences that extended beyond the fate of any single individual. This transformation did not occur suddenly, nor did it occur uniformly across all empires, but it emerged gradually from necessity, shaped by prolonged warfare, expanding diplomacy, and the recognition that information, when gathered systematically and transmitted reliably, could alter the balance of power more effectively than brute force alone. In earlier centuries, spies were often expendable. They were sent with limited expectations of survival, tasked with gathering immediate intelligence, bribing a guard, opening a gate, or delivering a message whose success or failure would be known quickly. If they were caught, their fate was sealed, and the empire that sent them simply recruited another. But as states began to rely more heavily on sustained intelligence, on long-term observation of enemy courts, troop movements, economic conditions, and internal divisions, the value of experienced spies increased dramatically. A spy who understood court etiquette, regional politics, multiple languages, and the psychology of power was not easily replaced. He represented an investment, and investments changed how punishment was applied. Empires began to differentiate between spies who acted alone and those embedded within broader intelligence structures. A captured spy might no longer be punished immediately, not out of mercy but out of curiosity. Who trained him? Who paid him? Who received his reports? How long had he been active? Punishment became delayed, conditional, and strategic. A spy might be kept alive not because he deserved survival, but because he possessed knowledge that extended far beyond his own actions. This shift forced medieval rulers to confront a new dilemma. Public punishment deterred future spies, but it destroyed potential intelligence. Secrecy preserved intelligence, but reduced fear. Balancing these competing priorities became one of the central challenges of late medieval governance. Some rulers resolved this tension by creating layers of punishment. A spy might be interrogated extensively in private, his networks exposed and neutralized, before being executed publicly to restore the deterrent effect. Others chose substitution. They staged executions while secretly turning spies into double agents, manipulating appearances to satisfy public expectation while quietly exploiting the very people they claimed to have destroyed. In these cases, punishment became performance, truth became flexible, and reality itself became a tool. As espionage professionalized, so too did counter-espionage. States developed systems to detect not just individual traitors, but patterns of behavior, unusual correspondence, unexplained travel, sudden wealth, shifts in loyalty, using informants embedded within bureaucracies, courts, and religious institutions. This made punishment more targeted. Rather than sweeping purges, rulers increasingly focused on eliminating specific nodes within intelligence networks, hoping to disrupt information flow without destabilizing governance. Yet this precision carried its own risks. When punishment became selective, it appeared arbitrary. When executions became rare, they lost their symbolic force. And when spies learned the patterns of detection, they adapted once again. They learned to compartmentalize. They learned to limit knowledge. They learned to sacrifice expendable agents to protect valuable ones. Espionage matured, and punishment struggled to keep up. The medieval world stood at the edge of a transformation it could not fully control. Information was becoming a permanent feature of power, not a temporary advantage. Spies were no longer merely criminals or traitors. They were participants in a shadow system that mirrored official governance, complete with its own hierarchies, loyalties, and rules. And this raised a question that medieval rulers found deeply unsettling. If espionage could not be eliminated, only managed, then what did punishment actually achieve? As medieval empires confronted the growing sophistication of espionage, they began to understand a truth that was both unsettling and transformative. Certainty, not violence, was often the enemy of control, and punishment did not always need to be visible, explained, or even confirmed in order to be effective. In earlier centuries, punishment had relied on clarity: a body on a scaffold, a blinded noble in the street, a severed head above a gate. These were answers. They told the population exactly what had happened, exactly who had fallen, and exactly what loyalty required. But as espionage became more professional, more discreet, and more deeply embedded within administrative and diplomatic systems, clarity began to work against power rather than for it. Clear punishments produced clear lessons. Clear lessons produced adaptation, and adaptation produced spies who learned how to survive. So medieval rulers experimented with something far more destabilizing than execution. They experimented with uncertainty. A man would be arrested and never seen again. A court official would disappear from records, his name no longer spoken, his office quietly reassigned, his household dispersed without explanation. A foreign envoy would depart the capital, and no one would ever confirm whether he had left freely, been imprisoned, or been killed. Silence replaced spectacle, and silence bred fear of a different kind. When punishment was visible, people feared consequences. When punishment was invisible, people feared possibility. Anyone could imagine himself next. Anyone could wonder whether loyalty had already been judged and found wanting. This strategy was particularly effective in courts and bureaucracies, where status depended on recognition, presence, and favor. To vanish was to cease existing politically. No execution could replicate that effect. Disappearance erased not only the body but the story. There was no confession to analyze, no final words to reinterpret, no martyrdom to inspire imitation, only absence. And absence, paradoxically, invited endless speculation. Did he betray the ruler? Did he know too much? Did he anger the wrong patron? Was he dead or waiting? No answer was ever given. This ambiguity forced obedience inward. People did not need to be reminded of punishment. They reminded themselves. Yet this tactic carried a cost. Uncertainty undermined trust not only between ruler and subject, but between subjects themselves. Silence encouraged rumor. Rumor encouraged paranoia. Paranoia fractured cooperation. In such environments, spies found new opportunities. Fear isolated people from one another. Isolation created gaps, and gaps could be exploited. The medieval state, therefore, found itself locked in a continuous cycle. Punishment created fear. Fear created secrecy. Secrecy created espionage. Espionage created new forms of punishment. There was no stable endpoint, only adaptation. And as punishment became less visible, it also became more bureaucratic. Records were altered, accounts rewritten, charges reclassified. A man was no longer executed for treason. He was relieved of duty, reassigned, retired. The language of power softened even as its grip tightened. This linguistic shift mattered, because it marked the beginning of a separation between what was done and what was said, a division that allowed rulers to maintain the appearance of order while exercising extraordinary control beneath the surface. Punishment moved from the square to the archive, from the crowd to the clerk, from the body to the file. And this transformation changed the psychology of loyalty. People no longer feared punishment because they had seen it. They feared it because they could not see it. And in that fear, obedience became internalized, but uncertainty could not be used indiscriminately. Too much silence suggested chaos. Too many disappearances suggested instability. Rulers had to balance invisibility with reassurance, secrecy with legitimacy. They still needed occasional spectacle, an execution here, an exile there. Just enough visibility to remind the population that power remained present and decisive. This balancing act defined the late medieval approach to espionage and punishment, and it set the stage for a final evolution, one in which punishment was no longer the primary response to espionage at all, but one component within a broader system designed to manage loyalty continuously, rather than react to betrayal after it occurred. As medieval empires slowly recognized that punishment alone could not extinguish espionage, That fear could restrain behavior but not command belief, and that secrecy would always find new paths around violence. They began to pursue a far more ambitious and far more fragile goal: the deliberate construction of loyalty itself, not as a spontaneous moral virtue, but as a condition shaped, guided, and maintained by power. This was a profound shift. Rather than asking only how traitors should be punished, rulers increasingly asked how traitors might be prevented from coming into existence at all. Loyalty was no longer treated as a natural obligation that followed birth or oath alone. It became something that had to be cultivated continuously, reinforced through reward, ritual, privilege, and dependence, until obedience felt less like submission and more like self-interest. In courts across the medieval world, rulers surrounded themselves with systems designed to bind elites tightly to the center of power, making betrayal not only dangerous but irrational. Titles were multiplied. Honors were distributed selectively. Offices were made temporary, revocable, and dependent on favor rather than law. A man's position no longer rested solely on competence or lineage, but on proximity, usefulness, and visible loyalty. This instability was intentional. It ensured that ambition flowed upward rather than outward, that officials competed for favor rather than independence, and that potential spies were distracted by survival within the system rather than tempted by allegiance beyond it. Rewards became as important as punishments. Land grants, tax exemptions, marriage alliances, access to trade routes, control over courts and revenues. These were not simply incentives, they were anchors. To betray the ruler was no longer only to risk death, it was to lose everything that made life recognizable. Identity itself became conditional. Surveillance expanded alongside reward, not only to catch traitors but to observe loyalty in action, who attended ceremonies enthusiastically, who spoke cautiously, who formed friendships too freely, who withdrew too often. These observations were rarely formal, they were social. Gossip became intelligence. Rumor became data. Silence became suspicious. The medieval court transformed into a space where every interaction carried potential meaning, where behavior was constantly interpreted, and where loyalty had to be performed repeatedly to remain credible. In this environment, espionage became more subtle, but also more psychologically taxing. A spy could no longer rely on secrecy alone. He had to simulate belief. He had to appear loyal not only in words, but in emotion, in habit, in instinct. A single hesitation, a poorly chosen silence, an insufficient display of outrage at a rival's execution could invite scrutiny. Punishment in this system was increasingly selective. It targeted those who failed to perform loyalty convincingly. And because punishment was no longer routine, it regained its power. When someone fell, it felt significant again. It suggested intention rather than randomness. This was not justice, it was calibration. Yet manufacturing loyalty carried its own dangers. When loyalty became performative, sincerity disappeared. People learned how to look loyal rather than how to be loyal. They learned which phrases to repeat, which rituals to exaggerate, which enemies to denounce. And spies learned this language best of all. They mimicked devotion with precision. They studied the rhythms of obedience. They hid in plain sight. As loyalty became more artificial, betrayal became more sophisticated. The state responded by tightening its grip further, creating closed circles of trust, restricting access to information, compartmentalizing authority so that no individual could see the whole picture. This fragmentation reduced the damage a single spy could cause, but it also slowed decision-making, fostered internal rivalry, and increased dependence on intermediaries. Power became cautious. Caution bred delay, and delay created new vulnerabilities. By the later medieval period, empires found themselves locked in a delicate equilibrium, balancing fear and reward, secrecy and ceremony, punishment and performance, all in an effort to manage a threat that could never be fully eliminated. Espionage was no longer an anomaly. It was an expected condition of rule. And punishment, once the defining response to betrayal, became only one instrument among many, still feared, still decisive, but no longer sufficient on its own. This realization did not end medieval practices of brutal punishment. Executions continued, mutilations continued, exile and erasure continued, but their meaning shifted. They were no longer statements of absolute control. They were acknowledgments of failure. Each punished spy was proof that loyalty had not been perfectly manufactured, that secrecy had slipped through the cracks, that power had been challenged. And it was this quiet recognition, never spoken aloud but deeply felt, that shaped the final centuries of medieval statecraft. No medieval empire punished spies in isolation. Every execution, every blinding, every disappearance was observed, recorded, interpreted, and quietly studied by rival powers, not only as an act of justice or cruelty, but as a revelation, a glimpse into how another state understood loyalty, fear, and control. Punishment was information. Foreign envoys watched carefully. Merchants carried stories across borders. Chroniclers preserved details that armies could not. A severed head on a gate did not speak only to the local population. It spoke outward across frontiers to other rulers who asked themselves not whether they would punish spies, but how. Medieval diplomacy was inseparable from surveillance. Ambassadors were expected to observe more than negotiate. They counted guards. They noted rituals. They listened to gossip. And when a spy was punished, the method mattered. Was it public or private, swift or delayed, final or ambiguous? Each answer revealed something about the state that delivered it. An empire that executed spies publicly signaled confidence, authority, and a willingness to rule through spectacle. An empire that punished quietly signaled caution, complexity, and a preference for control over intimidation. Rival rulers took note. They compared outcomes. If public executions provoked unrest, they avoided them. If disappearance bred paranoia, they copied it. If mutilation deterred rivals without creating martyrs, they adopted it. Punishment traveled, not as law but as practice. Western rulers learned from Byzantium that killing was not always necessary. Islamic courts observed European spectacle and refined their restraint. Mongol successors absorbed local traditions and blended terror with administration. Chinese dynasties studied nomadic practices and adapted collective punishment to frontier threats. There was no single model. There was experimentation, and experimentation meant failure. Some punishments backfired. An execution meant to deter rebellion instead inspired it. A public humiliation turned a traitor into a symbol of resistance. A purge weakened governance more than espionage ever could. These failures were noticed. They were discussed in letters, chronicles, and quiet conversations between rulers and advisors who understood that punishment was not just an act, it was a message, and messages could be misread. This awareness led to imitation with variation. Empires rarely copied punishments exactly. They modified them. They adjusted scale, visibility, and frequency. They learned to tailor punishment to audience. A punishment meant for elites differed from one meant for soldiers. A punishment meant for foreigners differed from one meant for citizens. A punishment meant for border regions differed from one meant for capitals. Punishment became contextual. This was a subtle but important development. It marked a shift away from universal terror toward calibrated fear. And calibrated fear required knowledge. Knowledge of culture, knowledge of psychology, knowledge of timing. Ironically, this meant that rulers had to think like spies in order to punish them effectively. They had to anticipate interpretation. They had to imagine how information would travel. They had to predict how fear would spread or fail to spread. Punishment became strategic communication. And like all communication, it could be intercepted, distorted, or repurposed by enemies. A rival empire might use the punishment of a spy as propaganda, framing it as evidence of tyranny or instability. A foreign ruler might protect defectors publicly to signal moral superiority. A captured spy might be celebrated elsewhere as a hero. Medieval rulers were not naive about this. They understood that punishment could strengthen enemies as well as deter them, and so they refined it further. Some punishments were designed to be deniable. Others were meant to be misunderstood. Some were exaggerated, others minimized. Truth became negotiable. Appearance became decisive. By the later medieval period, punishment for espionage had become part of an international language of power, one in which states communicated strength, restraint, legitimacy, and resolve without ever speaking directly. A single execution could end negotiations. A single pardon could invite betrayal. A single disappearance could shift alliances. Spies were not the only ones listening. Every ruler was. And as this silent dialogue intensified, another transformation began to take shape, one that would change how punishment itself was remembered, not as a single act, not as a single body, but as precedent. In the end, when all the executions are counted, when the methods are named and categorized, when empires rise and fall and the dust of centuries settles, what remains is not the cruelty itself, nor even the fear it produced, but the meaning behind it. The reason medieval empires punished spies and traitors the way they did, and what those punishments were truly meant to preserve. Because medieval punishment was never only about the spy. It was about certainty in a world that had very little of it. Empires in the Middle Ages lived with constant instability. Borders shifted, dynasties collapsed, plagues erased populations, faith divided societies. Communication was slow, unreliable, and easily distorted. In such a world, information was power in its purest form, and anyone who controlled information, who could hide it, steal it, or redirect it, held the ability to reshape reality itself. Spies understood this before rulers fully did. That is why rulers responded with such intensity. The punishments we have explored, blinding, mutilation, execution, erasure, exile, collective destruction, were not random expressions of brutality. They were attempts to restore certainty, to reassert control over a world that resisted it at every level. When Byzantium blinded a traitor, it was not merely injuring a body, it was enforcing a rule about who could be seen as legitimate. When Western Europe staged public executions, it was not simply killing, it was narrating order to a watching population. When Islamic empires imprisoned spies in silence, they were not hiding weakness, they were preventing chaos. When the Mongols erased spies without ceremony, they were declaring that hesitation itself was unacceptable. When Imperial China punished entire families, it was asserting that loyalty was not individual but structural, woven into lineage, memory, and time. Each empire answered the same question differently. How do we survive betrayal? And each answer revealed something fundamental about how that empire understood power. Some believed power was theatrical. Some believed it was sacred. Some believed it was absolute. Some believed it was fragile. But all believed it had to be defended at any cost. And yet, despite all this violence, all this calculation, all this fear carefully cultivated and enforced, espionage never disappeared. Spies continued to cross borders. Secrets continued to travel. Empires continued to fall. This is the final irony of medieval punishment. The more violently rulers tried to control loyalty, the more they revealed how uncertain that loyalty truly was. Punishment could destroy bodies. It could erase names. It could terrify generations. But it could not eliminate ambition. It could not eliminate resentment. It could not eliminate the human desire to know, to survive, to gain advantage, or to serve a cause larger than fear. In this sense, spies were not anomalies. They were symptoms. They existed because empires were powerful, and because that power was worth undermining. And so the punishments inflicted upon them became mirrors, reflecting not only the cruelty of the age, but its anxieties, its beliefs, and its limits. The Middle Ages did not lack intelligence. They lacked security. They compensated with punishment. Today, we no longer blind traitors in public squares. We no longer quarter bodies at city gates. We no longer erase families from genealogies, but we still isolate, we still imprison, we still erase identities. We still punish espionage as something different, something exceptional, something that exists outside ordinary morality, because the underlying fear has not changed. Power still fears what it cannot see. States still fear betrayal from within. And secrets are still worth risking everything to obtain. The medieval world understood this with brutal clarity, and in the punishments it left behind, it recorded a truth that still echoes across centuries. Empires do not punish spies because spies are weak. They punish them because spies reveal where power is vulnerable, and that vulnerability, more than any enemy army, has always been the greatest threat of all.